Okay, let's read the text, a short text this morning. I'm in the New American Standard in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31. Jesus has just talked about the standard for purity in the heart of men, right? If someone looks on a woman to lust for her, he has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Strong, radical responses are required at times, and he talks about tearing or plucking out the eye or cutting off the hand. And then with respect to marriage, he says in Matthew 5:31, it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So we see here Jesus referencing the Old Testament where it is recorded that there was this certificate of divorce that could be given. In the Old Testament, in the Jewish law, it was only the man that was allowed to do this. And the law in Deuteronomy 24, we'll look at it in just a minute, was actually to protect the woman so that the man couldn't hop in, hop out, hop in when it suited his purpose, I think is the intent. But it shows us in that text that God holds marriage and the sexual relationship in an absolute sacred manner. And even when he allowed divorce, the teaching there lets us know that for God, marriage and the sexual relationship is sacred, and because of its sacredness, sexual immorality outside of marriage is an abomination. It's something that makes God angry. It's something that if you think about him elevating marriage as a sacred relationship, people who dishonor that, right, would be committing a sin that would incur God's wrath. So Jesus makes the marriage relationship something that requires an absolute commitment, right? And that's what I want us to kind of focus on. The lesson for us is to understand the commitment, and for those of us who are married, right, rededicate ourselves every day to the commitment that we've made because of God's requirement for us to maintain this relationship. There's a means by which we can find happiness in the relationship, but only when we do it God's way. And if God says, stick together in thick and thin, and we don't do it his way, we're just we might stick it out and just be miserable. And nobody wants that. So a few introductory thoughts there. Got a number of things I want us to go through. We're not going to have time to look at all of these other texts, but I want us to at least note that the teaching that includes the idea of the marriage relationship and some separation in marriage, at times that results in divorce, and then whether or not there's an option to be remarried. These are the main texts. You might have some other texts that you want to share. There's certainly things in the historical accounts that we could look at in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah with respect to unlawful marriages that were dissolved because they were unlawful. We could even, in the New Testament history, look at the example of Herod and the teaching of John the Baptist, right? Where he specifically tells Herod when he has his brother's wife, whose name was Herodias, John says, it is not lawful for you to have her. So there's other passages, certainly. These are the main ones that provide teaching that are not in a historical context, it's just, here's the teaching. So Jesus mentions it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then there's some teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 where Paul gives some instruction. What if someone just leaves? What if you have an unbelieving spouse that departs? And there's some instruction there. But one common denominator in all of this is that God's intent is for one man and one woman to come together in a marriage relationship, and for that to be a monogamous relationship, right? Sexual fidelity, and for there not to be other relationships outside of marriage before or during, and only certain circumstances where there could be a divorce that would be lawful and then a subsequent remarriage. I think this is probably an easy question, I don't know, but what's the first thing that God says in the Bible is not good?
That man should be alone.
Yeah. It is not good for man to be alone. I'm thinking about that here. I will make him a helper suitable to him. Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. So, when we go back to the origin of man in the book of Genesis, God's creating everything and he says, it's good, it's good, it's good. He saw everything that he created and behold, it was very good. And then we come to Genesis 2:18 and God says it's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable to him. So, God's intent from the very beginning is that a man have this relationship that we're going to see is marriage, and that God creates the woman to be this suitable companion. Some translations say helpmeet, but the idea is that the relationship together is going to be good, it's going to be pure, it's going to be holy, it's going to be helpful, and it's the foundation ultimately of our society in many ways. And really throughout the world, even countries, that would not be Christian nations, there's this institution of marriage and this idea of a man and a woman coming together in marriage in nearly all societies that is understood and I want to say respected. I think to some degree it is, but certainly even here in America, right, where our founding fathers, wanted to build a nation based on trust in God, right? And we see that all over our money. We've evolved to where marriage is not respected, but historically it has been. And it's something that's nearly universal in most societies. God's plan from the beginning, right? Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The text in verse 25 there, this is before the fall of man, says that the man and woman were naked and they were not ashamed. In this relationship, it's one of intimacy, and before the fall of man, they were not clothed as we are now and lived in this intimate oneness, right? And God says from the beginning that there's a new family, there's a new relationship that is to be respected and to be independent and to be autonomous, right? A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So that's always been God's plan and God's intent, but Jesus references this other law, and I think we can understand man's reaction to God's plan. God says, one man, one woman for your life. And What does man find when he tries God's plan? What does God's plan require? There's all kind of answers you could give me. I'm not looking for just one thing. Maybe not at the same time. Who said something over here?
Commitment is on the board.
Okay, commitment is on the board. Somebody?
Dedication.
What? Okay, dedication, right? Obedience. And selflessness. Yeah, and think about all these things. And my question was, what does man find? Well, commitment and dedication and selflessness and obedience. What does man find when he tries to exhibit all of those things?
Peace.
What?
Peace.
Okay, he finds peace. Want a little help here. Hey, we just stepped into the real world. It's difficult. It's challenging. It's hard. Like, especially Eric up here said selflessness. We've got that on the slide. David, I think in the back, said peace. Yeah, when you do it and you continually manifest selflessness, yeah, you find peace, you find joy, you find happiness. But a lot of times before you find peace, joy, and happiness, you find out it's not so easy to be selfless all day, every day, when you're married to a numbskull, right, who challenges your selflessness, right, and stresses your last nerve, and doesn't in any way always exhibit selflessness toward you, right? It's a hard thing. People are different, and we won't get into this in an in-depth manner, but God made men and women different so that we can complement one another, but at times our differences can exacerbate the challenge or make the challenge very real and very difficult because our partner generally, many times, thinks very differently. And what we bring to the marriage, men and women, complement and strengthen one another ultimately, but at times it is the basis upon which it's difficult. So what I'm saying is man's reaction is, I don't really like this plan. Sometimes you have a child and you're bringing him or her up and you have them do something and it's not easy. They don't like it, right? Hey, this is hard. And when you go over to Matthew chapter 19 and see the other teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is talking to the disciples in verse 7. Jesus has just given us this classic verse, Matthew 19, verse 6. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Quoting the King James Version there with the word asunder. But let not man separate. God has joined this together, and it's not man's place to try to dissolve it or separate it or put it asunder. So when Jesus says this, Matthew 19:6, the Pharisees respond and say, well, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? Clearly Moses thought something else. And Jesus' answer shows us or gives us some insight into man's reaction to God's plan. He says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And we'll stop there when you look at the next couple of verses later in the class. But he says, because of the hardness of your heart. And the hardness of man's heart shows that man had a problem with God's plan. It was difficult. And man expressed that, and God made a provision in the Old Testament. And Jesus says that is not what was intended from the beginning. Look, there's a lot we could talk about here. There's so much we can talk about trying to get through understanding God's teaching here. I don't want us to get bogged down in certain parts of the discussion that we could get bogged down into, but you could certainly ask the question, why in the world would God allow that? I think it's difficult to say that definitively, but God clearly made this allowance, and the hardness of men's hearts, it really just shows God's willingness to work with the Israelites, but it was not his intent, and Jesus says it's not something that's going to be under consideration in this new kingdom. The teaching where God allows it, let me get my Old Testament here, in Deuteronomy 24, I'd like for us to go ahead and just look at this briefly. This is specifically what the Pharisees are referencing. I say the Pharisees. It's what the Pharisees are referencing in Matthew 19. It's what Jesus is referencing in Matthew 5:31. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she leaves and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. A couple things that I want to say here. One, what I've already referenced, where it says, if you're not compliant with this, it's an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land. That shows God, even in this exception that he allowed because of the hardness of the hearts of the Israelite nation, shows us how he elevates this relationship and holds it in a sacred manner, and says when you don't comply with this, it's an abomination. It's something that the idea of something that's an abomination is something that is hated, right? Something that is viewed with disgust or detestable. And that's something that, with respect to marriage in general, our society needs that. Our next generation needs that. When you think about how much marriage and divorce there is, and people get married and don't think about the seriousness of the commitment, at age 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, some of these super young ages, they haven't been taught. And so it's a problem in our society. And one of the solutions in my mind is it must be elevated in the teaching early that this is important. And God calls sexual immorality here an abomination. So that's an important lesson. And then also, even though when you read this initially, you might not think this sounds fair to the woman, God's intent here is to protect this woman so that a man can't just send her away and then later, when he wants some, sexual fulfillment, jump back into the relationship, and then she can be invited in when he wants something and cast out when he doesn't. So God says you can't come back here when you decide to do this thing that Jesus is letting us know is only because of the hardness of the hearts of the Israelite nation. So the hardness of the heart is certainly very relevant. God certainly doesn't smile upon hard-hearted people, right? But he did make this allowance here, and Jesus is saying this is not something that's going to be allowed to continue. Yes, sir?
In verse 8, when it says, from the beginning it was not so, we know why there was a change and when there was a change?
The only information we have really is that passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24. So that kind of tells us when. Jesus kind of tells us why. but the when and the why doesn't give us all the details. Right? When Jesus says, because of the hardness of their hearts, and all we have is Deuteronomy 24, what would have had to have happened based on what Jesus says?
A divorce.
Yeah, some divorce, but there would have been some kind of complaining probably to Moses, or some type of discussion where it was communicated, right? People saying kind of what I'm saying on this slide. Hey Moses, you gotta give me a break here. This marriage relationship is killing me. And we just don't have insight into all the historical details. There's certainly a lot of historical details that, right, the Bible would be thousands of pages, millions of pages even. Yes, sir. Who is that in the back? Go ahead, Michael. Roger, sorry.
I think we need to be careful about that word allow. We need to understand what Jesus is teaching here.
Yeah.
What the Pharisees did and the teachers of the law back in the Old Testament days, what they did was they twisted the law. They turned it, and God allowed them to do that through the hardness of their heart. The choice was still man. He could be obedient or he could be disobedient.
Right.
But he couldn't be both.
Right.
But they wanted what they wanted selfishly.
Right.
And the nature of man, as created by God, gives man the choice. So what God allows doesn't mean that he approves. And the problem comes in when, through the hardness of his heart, we stop being really strict with the way we interpret God's word.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm saying aloud, but everything you're saying, I mean, the hardness of the hearts of men was not good, and the hardness of the hearts of men indicate an intent to do what they want to do instead of what God wants to do, and that's certainly not a good thing. Jesus says permitted or allowed in Matthew 19, and there is this, I don't know what to call it, Roger, except an allowance, but it's, as Roger said, only based on the hardness of the hearts of men, which is not, I got hands all over the place, like hand. Obviously not a spirit that is in any way seeking to please God if it's based on a hard heart. I don't know if you want to kind of come this way, David?
Don't you reckon, though, that the reason it was allowed because of the generosity of God and his willingness to allow us time or his patience with us?
Very
He doesn't
reasonable.
always exact a vengeance for disobedience.
Yeah, very, very reasonable. And we haven't even gotten to like Malachi 2:16, like God's real view of this whole thing. Jim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, in Deuteronomy, this translation uses the word indecency.
Oh, right.
Matthew and Deuteronomy. Does that strictly mean adultery? Today, pornography is rampant.
Yeah.
And what about forgiveness of the erring spouse? Can you-
This is good questions. I mean, I can give you some thoughts on it. We're going to be in the deep waters for a long time.
Not that they've erred, can you just divorce them like that?
Well, in Deuteronomy 24, the word indecency there is not the same level of unfaithfulness as the word fornication or porneo in the Greek in Matthew 19:9 or Matthew 5:32. So it was a more liberal allowance, right? And that's why the Jews respond as they did. The other part of your questions take a while to dig into all those. I'm not going to try to answer all this right now. I can come back to you, but other people have their hands up first. Jeff or who?
I was just going to say, I think you either Wednesday or previous Sunday said there were things that God didn't vocally oppose, even though his word says he's opposed to those things. The Bible doesn't have to say that God is rejecting something the entire time. Israel having a king, I think, is one example. That was never God's intent.
Right.
And in the discourse with Samuel, he said, they have chosen this
Right.
But if you go back to what he originally intended, that was not what he had in mind for them.
That's right.
That wasn't his will.
That's right. And even though it wasn't his will, we still see his provision for when it happened, even as far back as Deuteronomy, even though it didn't come up in the history until 1 Samuel. That's a good example, I think, that is helpful. Rusty?
Yeah, I guess it's dangerous for us to get in our echo chamber and say, well, God allowed this.
Yeah.
The scripture doesn't say God allowed it. We just said that God allowed it. The scripture says that from the beginning, God made it so that man and woman were to not be separated.
That's right.
And in this very verse, it doesn't say God allowed it. It says Moses.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, yeah.
Your hearts allowed it.
Yes, good point.
But from the beginning, it was not so. So it just goes back and goes full circle to reiterate. God didn't allow it. God said, until death do you part. Moses allowed it.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. The only counterpoint I would offer is either God gives us Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, or he doesn't. Right? So yeah, Jesus says Moses permitted it. Jesus' word's going to stand. I think you're making a good point. I hope Moses was only giving us what God was giving him in Deuteronomy 24. All right, look, we can get into deep waters. I'm going to cut it off here in a minute, but I saw Andrew. Oh, wait, no, I saw Devin. I'm going to go Devin, Andrew. I don't know. I might come back to you, Bruce. What's your name again, sir? Caleb. Oh, sorry for forgetting. All right. When we're done, you guys are going to have like a 20-second and a timer. Devin, Andrew, Bruce, Caleb. Go.
I think this will be quick. I think I agree. God regulated certain things. I think that's where I look at. Even though that wasn't his intention. He
Yeah.
regulated things in the Old Testament. Slavery, polygamy, divorce. These are all things that they're certainly not God's intention from the beginning. But he gave man certain rules, and I think here, due to the hardness of man's heart.
Right.
But then I look at passages like Acts 17:30,
Yeah.
and that's in the context of adultery and such things. But still, truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. So there were things that God, I guess, overlooked. He regulated, but that's no longer the case.
Yeah.
Now that the New Testament is in force, it's no longer like that. God's not overlooking man's ignorance anymore.
Yeah, that's right. If you have a different view of Acts 17:30, I'm not going to get into that right now. Just know that there are other views on exactly what that means. But that's a good comment in general as far as the regulation. Definitely those examples were good. Andrew?
I do think overlook is a great synonym for the word allow. I think the word allow is very important to understand. And one thing that I do not think is a synonym to it is approve. I think sometimes we get in our own heads and we think allow means approve. It does not mean approve.
Yeah.
Right? No more than when you're letting your kids play outside with their siblings and they're being kind of rough, you sometimes allow that even though you don't approve of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes God does draw that line though.
Yeah.
Don't let our kids play in the street because that can kill them.
Right.
God does draw that line in the Bible as well. You will not cross this line. We
Right.
see many examples.
Right.
But he did not approve of this.
Right.
But for some reason, right, we don't have all the answers. Moses allowed it.
Right. I got a comment I'll get to in a minute when I come back to my slides here. Bruce?
Bottom line, God required the death penalty for adultery.
Yeah. That's right. Death penalty for adultery, and then the thing that's so tough with everything, though, is God's still merciful and forgiving, right? You got David. It's like this classic example. All right, Caleb, and then we're moving on.
So if I don't voice this properly, but maybe it's has something to do with sin and damage trickling down from a given situation, and the possibility of things becoming worse and just more damage, more sin being caused from a given situation.
Yeah, that's right. Let's move on here, and because really, what is Jesus? Let's get to what Jesus is saying. This is a whole other thing. Man's reaction to Jesus' teaching is, "Hey, this is hard business." Right, Matthew 19:9. I say to you, Jesus speaking, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. the disciples heard this teaching and they're like, oh, mercy. I don't even know if this is a good thing. It's better not to marry. And that's just man's reaction to this teaching. And everything we've talked about here, Matthew 5:31 and Matthew 19, where Deuteronomy 24 is referenced, what is Jesus saying? I'm calling you to a higher standard, right? I'm calling you to respect God's law as it was originally intended, and there's have still been allowed based on Deuteronomy 24 in the Old Covenant, not some disagreement on how to raise the kids. It's one man and one woman being committed for their life. And here's the thing, even the discussion this morning, we see how it's kind of challenging, but we can agree on this fundamental point, right? One man, one woman for life. That's what Jesus is saying was God's expectation from the beginning, and that's what Jesus is saying is God's expectation in this new kingdom. And by extension, we can certainly articulate and understand that that's God's expectation for us today. Adam?
I think a lot of the problem comes from this is just because there's so much selfishness in it. And I think a lot of times and I was reading this book and it was talking about how we're not the main character of the story.
Mm.
You know, this is not our story that we're living. You know, we're living God's story.
Right.
You know, we're just characters in it.
Right.
You know, we like to think a lot of times we're the main character and that, you know, we're the important one.
Right.
We're not. You know, so I think that's a lot of times you got to get past that.
Yeah, that's right. Good thoughts that this is all God's plan, God's story, and we're just a part of it, a small piece of a huge puzzle. And here's what I think Jesus is getting at, right? This is what we should have focused on. Jesus is calling men and women to an undying love for one another, unquenchable, unflinching, unrelenting, right? That's what this Sermon on the Mount is going to be all about. That's what Jesus is going to show us the way, right? His absolute sacrificial love. And then Paul's going to write in Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives as Jesus loved the church and gave himself for it, right? I think the teaching that Jesus is wanting to proclaim early and often and loudly from the rooftop is have this love, have this attitude, have this spirit in yourselves. Jesus is calling us to complete commitment. Commit to this one person and do everything that you can to show love, selflessness. And I've got the word selflessness that Eric mentioned. This is what Jesus is calling us to, right? Sacrificial love, selfless love, submissive love. One that's just looking out for the best for the object of our love. So the whole idea of divorce in this new covenant, there's just this one exception. It's a commitment that Jesus' intent is for us to have the Spirit to be committed to work through difficult times, right? In sickness and in health, for richer or for poor, and find joy in that selflessness. And this is the basis upon which we go back to Matthew 5:20, right? Except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees are they're the ones even bringing up Deuteronomy 24, this certificate of divorce. That Jesus wasn't even bringing that up. He answers it when they bring it up, but his teaching, everything about what he's calling them to do as the king of this new kingdom is this selflessness, this sacrificial love, this submissive love. And that's what I think our focus really needs to be, because that's how we embody the Spirit of Christ. That's how we fulfill Matthew 5:16, right? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. We're just a few verses down from that, and one of the means by which we can do that is being selfless in our marriages, and then we interact with people in work or at school or wherever we have friendships and relationships, and we communicate to them what we try to do in our marriage, right? And they're communicating to us, my marriage was really hard. My marriage is no fun. I'm thinking about getting out of my marriage. I was talking to a guy just 3 days ago at my job. I was trying to get him to go work out with me and went to work out. And the workout was pitiful. I'm sorry, this guy is not ready for any type of actual fitness. But he started talking about wanting to separate from his wife, and I started talking to him, and he was talking about, we're just incompatible, and just, I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what? And he starts giving me this example, and I'm like, that's not something that's a hill to die on. That's not some big issue. That's a time to be selfless, right, or sacrificial. When we seek to have this spirit that Jesus calls us to about this kind of selfless and sacrificial love, it's a means by which we can have the righteousness that God calls us to and be a light to the world. We still got 7 minutes, depending on how crazy you guys get. Might get a little further here. All right, the exception clause. Except it be for sexual immorality, Jesus says. You might have the words fornication or the word unchastity as far as our English words. Greek word is porneo. A lot of times that's translated fornication. Certainly we understand the principle of sexual immorality. I don't know if we're going to be able to... I can answer what I believe. The answer is to Jim's question about pornography. But I don't want to get into a bunch of examples. And I'm hesitant to do it because I think it could lead to more questions. A guy looks at pornography and his wife catches him and says, I'm getting a divorce. I'm saying that's not in bounds for what Jesus is saying. Now, this is the one time, it's the first time. Well, then you're like, well, what if he did it every day for 5 years? All right, look, we could get into hypotheticals for a long time. My understanding here, and this is just me, I'm not saying this is not authoritative teaching of the Mountain View Church of Christ, but I think I certainly have scriptural basis for it. When the woman is brought to Jesus in John chapter 8, what do the Pharisees say about how she was caught? In the act, right? There was an act. There was something that was physically being done, right? That is the basis upon which she's brought. Now, I'm not trying to say, well, the act is the act, and it doesn't matter what's in your heart. We've just gotten done talking about if a man is looking on a woman with lust, and that would certainly include pornography. We've already taught on that. He's committing adultery already with a woman in his heart. I just don't think that means she can immediately run to the divorce court and get a divorce and then be scripturally remarried. I'm not opening that up. I'm happy to talk to you about that later. There's a lot of hypotheticals we could get into that could take a while to get them all answered. Yes, sir.
One thing I think that we can take consolation in the Word of God never puts us on the horns of a dilemma.
Right.
Between trying to decide between sin. That's really a secondary job of mankind.
Yep.
But God didn't put us on the horns of a dilemma where we have to choose between two evils.
Right.
There's a right way and there's a wrong way.
Right.
And one leads to salvation, the other leads to hellfire.
Yeah.
And we need to be very cautious whenever we start trying to twist what is said in the Word of God. It's so insidious, but I can't find it in the definition of porneo to be able to say definitively that would be a sin worthy of divorce.
Right.
But I would hesitate to not say it as a reason for real consternation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think well said. All right. With respect to, and I've started talking about some of these details around it, and the idea of sexual immorality or porneo or fornication. Certainly adultery, a sexual relationship outside of marriage with someone who is not one's spouse, and a sin that is against our spouse, against one's own body. Woody shared that verse, right? Is that 1 Corinthians? No, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Sorry, I'm losing my references there. But it's a sin against one's own body, and certainly a sin against God. It's one of those sins that's, it's against self, it's against spouse, it's against God. And it's the basis that Jesus gives here for a lawful divorce. It's interesting that's only found in the Gospel of Matthew. If you look at Mark's account in Mark 10, and you look at Luke's account in Luke 16, it doesn't say anything about except for sexual immorality. This is only Matthew, and Matthew does it both times, Matthew 19:9 and Matthew 5:32, right? And my point here is it's only one exception. It's only mentioned in this one gospel. If we were going to be technical, when the exception is given, it's only given for the man to be severing the relationship. Mark does provide the example of a woman getting a divorce. Mark's account does not include the exception clause. So I'm not saying anything definitive because of that. I'm just saying if you look at the text specifically and with a critical eye, you can notice some of these things that we might discern or distinguish and may or may not have some conclusion from that. Definitely what we see here is that Jesus, it goes back to what I wanted to call this lesson. It's a commitment. There's only this exception. It's only here in Matthew, and God's intent is for marriage to be preserved. We are about to run out of time. I wanted to have this slide because if you have a bunch of questions, my answer is this is the teaching, right? Everyone who divorces his wife except for the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. That's what Jesus says, Matthew 5:32. And you can look at some of the other texts in Luke 16 and Mark 10, Matthew 19. But the teaching is what Jesus says. And we make it harder by some of our religious hypotheticals, and sometimes those aren't hypotheticals, sometimes they're real situations. All right, we're about out of time. I do want to spend a little time in the Old Testament. We'll do that Wednesday night, but I want to give Matt Jones the opportunity to share a word.
Well, just, anytime we talk about marriage, for a very natural reason, I understand why we get into the physical side of marriage.
Yeah.
When God says, I'm providing a helper, it's not that the man be alone for a helper.
Right.
There is vastly more to that.
That's right.
Than the physical work.
That's right.
And for those of us that have been married, we were constantly learning how much we need that soul of the other person.
Right.
And that soul needs us.
Right.
And then when you, and so I say this because I'm really trying to draw us to a higher calling than focusing just on this physical.
That's right.
Because there is a spirit, there is a soul here.
Right.
And we need that soul, we need that relationship. God very much puts that in our life for a very good reason.
Yep. Great comment. Certainly an important point that our companion, our helper, our partner in this life is so much more than the sexual relationship, right? It's companionship, it's support, it's emotional support, it's spiritual support. The sexual relationship is a sliver, right? It's the only place that this relationship allows for it, but it's also something that's just one small part of it. Butch is the last word, and then we'll wrap up.
A lot of things we see on earth are just models of what's in heaven.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good last word.
Husband and wife begin to Christ in the church. And if the wife, husband and wife, is akin to Christ in the church, and if the wife drifts away, if you drift away from Christ, there's a good chance you're going to get divorced.
Definitely, Matthew 5 lets us know that this whole marriage relationship teaches us about Christ in the church, and that's an important thing because that's the real spiritual essence of our existence here is being a part of a church that is submissive to Christ. All right, we'll pick up a little bit of Old Testament. I've already lost my slide. Lord willing, Wednesday night.